appreciate what you said about lessons for us tonight. I think there's going to be some lessons for us tonight in chapter 13 and chapter 14. We're going to see some of the decision-making that Saul demonstrates for us, and we're going to learn kind of how he makes decisions. Just to recap, so last week, Saul's been made king, right? So going back a few Wednesdays, Saul was anointed by Samuel. This was affirmed to Saul that he was the king with all these different signs. Saul presented to the people, and long live the king. And then at the end of chapter 11, you have Saul being finally instituted as king. And you remember the last chapter that we covered last week in chapter 12 was really farewell address. So you've got Samuel kind of giving these warnings one more time. He says, if you will fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice and not rebel against his commandments, then, if both you and your king do this, then it will be well. And if you don't, then God's hand will be against you. And so he gives them these kind of last warnings like he's been giving them all along when they've been asking for a king. And then you remember that Samuel also said, if, however, you do disregard this, God is not going to forsake you for his great name's sake. And we talked about what that meant. So now moving into chapter 13, this starts, and I'm just going to kind of say this in passing because I don't think it's a main thing or a plain thing, but it starts out with saying Saul lived for 1 year and then became king. And when he had reigned for 2 years over Israel, and it goes on. We could squabble about, well, when was this and what time was that? Most of the commentaries think that probably that 1 year passing was sometime between his anointing and then being kind of finally instituted as king. We could debate that. I don't think it's all that important for the lessons that we're going to get from this. And then the 2 years after that, maybe that's the time passing between his institution as king and then what we're going to read about tonight. But the point is these first couple of verses, and we're not going to read the whole first section here, is really what we're going to see about Saul's decision-making. So look in verse 2. He's assembling an army, and he has 3,000 Israelites, and 2,000 are with him in Michmash. I tried to kind of blow up a section there of Israel. You can see Michmash. And then 1,000 are with his son Jonathan in Gibeah. And you'll see then in verse 3, kind of out of the blue, Jonathan goes off and defeats this outpost of Philistines. We haven't seen initiative like this from Saul. We're going to see it from Jonathan tonight, especially in the next chapter. And he defeats them, and then you'll see that Saul really makes a big deal about what's happened here to make sure that everybody knows about it. Interestingly, look at verse 4. Who gets the credit for the victory that Jonathan goes and wins? Saul. Look at verse 4. It says, and all Israel heard it said that Saul had defeated the garrison of the Philistines, and also that Israel had become a stench to the Philistines. So it wasn't Saul that defeated the Philistines, right? It's Jonathan. We're going to see kind of this contrast between Saul and Jonathan and as we go tonight. So then look how the Philistines respond, verse 5. And the Philistines mustered to fight with Israel 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen and troops like the sand on the seashore in multitude. So now we've got these two kind of nations that are another. Is my microphone going out? Is that? You got two nations kind of fighting with one another. I have this mental image of like, from the, I'm not sure, am I doing something wrong? Of like May Day from the Cold War with the Soviet Union, right? You've got this huge military parade. I mean, it says, troops like the sand on the seashore. So they're putting on this huge show of force to date the Israelites. And so the Israelites know that the Philistines don't like them. Jonathan has now defeated a small group of them. And then they look out and they see this army like sand on a seashore. How did the Israelites respond to this? What's that? They hid. Yeah. Verse 6, when the men of Israel saw that they were in trouble, for the people were hard-pressed, the people hid themselves in caves and in holes and in rocks and in tombs and in cisterns. And some Hebrews crossed the fords of the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul was still at Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. So these Israelites saw that they were in trouble, and when they see this display of troops, some of them start to take off, right? They're hiding in caves. They're hiding in cisterns. They're running. Some cross the Jordan and leave. They're shaking. They're scared. And so you got this picture of this deeply unsettled situation with this nation, with their relatively new king. Just a chapter or two ago, we were talking about, man, long live the king. Saul's our guy. Please, God, give us Saul. We want this king. And he's the guy that defeats the Ammonites. Remember, the Spirit rushes on him, and they defeat these Ammonites. And now, in just a short period of time, now they're running and they're hiding, fearing for their lives. Let's get to the heart of this chapter. So let's start reading in verse 8. He, Saul, waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, "Bring the burnt offering here to me, and the peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offering. As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him and greet him. Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul said, "When I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." And Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God with which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." So there's about when was Saul given this command about the 7 days and to wait 7 days. If you go in, you might remember that when Samuel first anointed Saul, he actually gives him this command. He gives him all these signs that what he was telling him came from God. But then he also said to him, this is back in chapter 10, "Go down before me to Gilgal, and behold, I'm coming down to you to offer burnt offerings and to sacrifice peace offerings. 7 days you shall wait until I come to you and show you what you shall do." I'm not suggesting that 7 days is a command to wait 7 days here. That a lot of time has passed between those. Maybe it's the case that the meeting at Gilgal and waiting 7 days was kind of like a ritual that they did. I don't think it's all that. It's clear from Saul's reaction that he knew he was supposed to wait 7 days. So the when or the how that was communicated to him, I think, is kind of irrelevant. So if it's indisputable that he knew he was supposed to wait until Samuel came, he waits 7 days. But what's happening? The people are scattering. Samuel hasn't arrived. Let me ask this question. Do you think that Saul thought it was important or unimportant for these sacrifices to be made? What's that? Important, right? I agree. He thinks it's something that has to occur, right? How long did Samuel tell him to wait? 7 days. How long did he wait? He waited for him 7 days. And then, we don't know when he finally shows up. And he's like, well, I'm going to do this myself. We have to do this. We have to get the Lord's blessing. We need God on our side before we go into this. And then you'll see in Saul, in his rebuttal, tells Samuel, well, you didn't come within the appointed time. So he starts to kind of excuse himself. Next question. What would you say was Saul's mistake? Yes, sir. I agree completely. That's what I wrote down. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding, right? Understand leaning on. Saul's, right? He's in a desperate situation. And so what does he do? Well, he offers the burnt offering himself. And of course, as soon as he does, here comes Samuel. Do you get the impression that Saul initially had remorse or embarrassment or disappointment about what he had done. Right? Yeah. He's making excuses. Look at verse 10. Look what it says he did. As soon as he had finished, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him and greet him. So you don't get this sense of like, oh, I shouldn't have done that, right? He's welcoming him. He's like, Samuel, you're here. Finally, you made it. Where have you been? And then look at what Samuel says. Samuel said, what have you done? It's ironic we're talking about this tonight because if you remember on Sunday, this came up in Scott's sermon. This what have you done is a simple but recurring question throughout the Bible. So, Garden of Eden, when God approaches Adam and Eve, the question God asks Eve, what have you done? We talked about Cain and Abel on Sunday. The question that God poses to Cain when he approaches him, he says, what have you done? Back in Joshua, when Achan steals and hides and lies, Joshua approaches Achan. He says, what have you done? So you get this question coming up over and over again. Here's Samuel asking Saul, what have you done? What is Saul's defense? Oh, yes, ma'am. Ah. So maybe Saul's trying to kind of like tidy up real quick and right, nothing to see here. One of the commentators I wrote mentioned the fact that, he was offering sacrifice. So you can imagine Samuel approaching and getting near and smelling that and thinking, what is he doing? What have you done? That's absolutely right. That's a great point. So Saul has been made king, Saul is priest, right? And here he is standing in the role of priest. What is Saul's defense? Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, so he's got 3,000 people. We'll see later it dwindles significantly down to 600-ish. And he says, hey, these people were leaving me. I was waiting on you. You didn't come. The ESV that I read said, I forced myself to offer this burnt offering. The New King James Version says, I felt compelled. And Saul says, look, Samuel, I was afraid of these Philistines. I knew it was important to do this. You hadn't come. I felt I had to do something. You have a comment? That's right. That's exactly right. This situation is unfolding, and I had to do something, right? Is Matt Purdom here tonight? Yeah. Hey, Matt. There's a legal argument, correct me if I'm wrong, known as the reasonable person standard. So in cases of negligence, so say someone feels like there's been an instance of negligence and they're suing someone else, you might invoke this reasonable person standard. And the reasonable person standard says, would a reasonable person have considered this behavior negligent? So this comes from back in the 1800s where there was a farmer and he cut down all his hay and he stacked it up right on the edge of his property, and it was dry, and there was a house right on the other side of the property, and the hay catches fire, and it immediately jumps across to the house and catches the house on fire. And in this case, as it was playing out, they invoked this argument. They said, would a reasonable person have thought that that was negligent? And so this has been repeatedly used. Is that fair? Yeah. Reasonable person. I had this friend in college who he considered himself kind of the wise sage in our group, and he always liked to call himself the reasonable person. So he always wanted to adjudicate. If we had a question, he's like, oh, I'm the reasonable person. So there's this reasonable person argument. So I asked the question, would you characterize Saul's behavior as reasonable or unreasonable, and why? I agree with you completely. It depends on whose understanding we're reasoning, right? Saul's saying, look, I did what any reasonable person would do. We needed to get this done. I was running out of time. The people are leaving. They've got soldiers like sand on the seashore. And this is a common way to justify behavior, right? If we generalize this is what we do. In light of the circumstances, well, given the circumstances, right? We don't come out and say it that way all the time, but when my son takes something from my daughter, and we say, well, why did you do that? It's like, well, because she took that from me. Because I wanted it, right? These are the circumstances. Consider the circumstances, and then my behavior is justified. This is self-justification. This is leaning on our own understanding. Look at Samuel's reply in verse 13. Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God with which he commanded you. Remember, Saul knew he was supposed to wait until Samuel arrived. And, you can imagine if you're reading the story, we've heard this story before, but if you're hearing this story for the first time, it's easy to say, well, why are we being so hard on Saul? Like, what's the big deal? I mean, he knew this had to be done. He had to do it. Look at the situation he was in. He was doing the reasonable thing. He was reasoning from his circumstances. They had soldiers like sand on the seashore. There's a song that I think we sing it at this congregation. It's in our songbook. It's called "'Tis So Sweet to Trust in Jesus." We sing that, right? Everybody knows that song. One of the verses says, "Oh, how sweet to trust in Jesus, just to trust his cleansing blood, just in simple faith to plunge me beneath the healing, cleansing flood." With all due respect to the intent of the song, and I'm not disputing the intent of the song, but is it always sweet? Is it always simple to trust in Jesus? Was this simple for Saul? Was he in a simple situation? Or was he being asked to trust in excruciating circumstances? Was he being asked to trust in hard circumstances where all the chips are stacked against him, and he's this king, and he's the one that has to make the decision, and he's trusting when he's being asked to trust when the opposition is like sand on the seashore and his numbers are dwindling? So I say that to make the point that it's easy to say, oh, he shouldn't have done that. He should have just listened to him. He told him what to do, so he should have just listened to what he said. But this is what we do, right? This is self-justification. This is leaning on our own understanding. And this is what Saul does. He sets his own heart and his own mind above the clear commands that he had been given. And so the implications in verse 13 are, Saul, if you had done what you were told, God would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now that's not going to happen. And so, I think we're being dishonest with ourselves if we think that trusting God will always be simple or sweet. When we think back on our lives and difficult situations that we find ourselves in, if they're difficult, then inherently it's not going to be easy. When there's no opposition, when there's nothing on the line, it's easy to trust in those situations. But can we trust when we're in Saul's situation? Can we trust in those situations, I think is the question. And, I would ask rhetorically, did God know the circumstances that Saul was in? Of course. Of course he did. Yeah. Right. I agree. I agree. It's a self-centered decision. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I hadn't considered that angle. I don't know. I don't know where Samuel was. I don't know. Sure. Well, the thing that's not totally clarified is, did he come? Saul says he doesn't come within the time allotted. Did he come on the seventh day? I don't know. The point being, that Saul wasn't. Yeah. Mm, right. Right. I also, yes, Scott. I was just going to say, I was thinking about Jesus in this too, and you think about what Jesus was going through when he was getting ready for the cross. What did Saul do? Saul was trying to illustrate his circumstances as an excuse for his behavior. When Jesus, did Jesus pause to acknowledge the circumstances? If it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not my will, but thine be done. He was trying to call God's attention to what he was going through, and he said, these are bad circumstances. Is there any other way? Yet, not what I want, but what you want. And that's the piece that's missing here with Saul, right? Jesus didn't use his circumstances as any excuse for his behavior, and that's what Saul did. Scott? Right. And, and all the warnings. Right. Right. Especially in light of, he's told the people over and over again, you want a king? Okay, here's how it's going to have to go. And then to be kind of involved in the scenario when it goes awry the very first time. Here, if I keep moving. Verse 13, so again, he defines what foolishness is. You have done foolishly. Foolishness, disobedience to God. We often think about foolishness as having some connotation with someone's cognition or their cognitive capacity, but we could go to verses. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Foolishness is disobedience or lack of acknowledgement of God. Yes, sir. Yeah, that's a good point, and we'll see in the next chapter, depending on how I use our time, that he does this again. He hastily kind of forgets to recognize God or call God in before they go on and do something. So it's a behavior that recurs again. So again, the consequences for Saul, he can't remain king. Remember, God has told them the stipulations for if you have a king, here's what he's going to have to do. He needs to obey. He has to follow all these things. And you haven't done that, so you're not going to be king. And then what kind of person is he going to replace him with? Well, he's going to replace him with someone who's after his own heart. The rest of this chapter, I think that's the heart of the chapter. The rest of this chapter is, Saul's situation. He's down to 600 men. He started with 3,000. He's now down to 600. The Philistines start to break up into these different companies and start to approach the Israelites. And then there's these details about they don't even have instruments to fight. They're having to use their plowing and agricultural instruments, and they don't even have a way to sharpen them. And so they're having to, this ridiculous situation where they're having to pay their enemy to sharpen their agricultural tools so they can use them to fight. And then we're kind of left at the end of this with the last verse where the Philistines are on the move, and it's got kind of this ominous picture to it. Let's keep going here, chapter 14. So they're in this bad spot. They're clearly outnumbered. And then it switches gears here to focus on Jonathan. So we've been thinking about Saul. Let's look at Jonathan. Start reading with me in verse 1. One day Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah in the pomegranate cave at Migron, and the people who were with him were about 600 men, including Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of the Lord in Shiloh, wearing an ephod. And the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Within the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistine garrison, there was a rocky crag on the one side and a rocky crag on the other side. The name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other was Seneh. The one crag rose on the north in front of Michmash, and the other on the south in front of Gibeah. Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." So you might characterize this behavior from Jonathan as somewhat audacious, right? So they've got all these men. He has this idea, me and my armor bearer, we're going to go over there. This is not initiative that we've seen by Saul yet. This is kind of unique to Jonathan as opposed to his father. And it includes these details about these rocky crags. My take home from that is it's even more audacious based on kind of the agriculture or the geographical landscape, and so this seems like a really preposterous thing to do. There's some secrecy involved, so he doesn't tell his father. We could question whether or not maybe that's because the last time he did something like this, his dad took all the credit. It doesn't say that, but we just saw that in the last chapter. So he doesn't tell his father. The people don't know that he's gone. And then there's this kind of inactivity of Saul. Where is Saul in this? Where did I just read? Where is Saul? He's lounging in the pomegranate cave, which sounds just like a cool place. If I was opening a store, like a coffee shop or a men's clothing store, I'd call it the pomegranate cave. And so you've got this kind of split screen where you've got Jonathan going off on this expedition, this kind of audacious expedition, and you've got Saul sitting at the coffee shop in the pomegranate cave. And he's got men with him. It includes some of the people that are with him. Interestingly, it includes that Ahijah, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli. We talked about Eli and his sons a few weeks ago. Remember, they were not, Hophni and Phinehas were not good guys. So let me ask this question. What did Jonathan say was possible? Emphasis on the possible. What did he say was possible? That's right. It may be that the Lord will work for us. So he says, let's go do this. He speaks to the possibility of what might happen. There's no presumption that God is going to do this. He says it's possible that he will. You see this as an example over and over again in the Bible. So I wrote some of these examples down. You remember back in Esther when Mordecai is talking to Esther? Mordecai tells her, "Who knows but that you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Who knows? So this element of possibility of how God might act. Remember in Philemon, when Paul is writing about Onesimus, this runaway slave, he says, perhaps this is why he was parted from you for a while, that you might have him back forever, no longer as a bondservant, but as a brother. So you see these examples of people in the Bible recognizing the possibility of how God might act, but not necessarily presuming to know how he might act. What about Jesus? My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, what we just read. Right? So I don't know if it's in your will, but maybe it is for this thing to happen. I think there's a lesson for us there about kind of how we pray and what we presume to expect from God, and what he will or he won't do. Now, as opposed to possibility, what does Jonathan say is certain? Right, so he lays out kind of his strategy, but even in this verse, he says, I don't know how God's going to act. He may be with us, he may not, but I know that nothing can stop him from saving by many or by few. So he knows that even if they've got 1 million soldiers, or however many the seashore is, and they've only got not 3,000, not 600, but it's him and his armor bearer, he has confidence that if it is God's will, then they can be saved through this. It's kind of reminiscent of Gideon, right? When Gideon starts with all these men and they whittle it down, and down. And the point wasn't that they needed 300 or even 1,000 or however many it was. The point was he wanted to get it so small so that there would be no question that this was God's doing, because he can save by many or by few. And then verse 7, notice the loyalty of this armor bearer who is kind of mentioned in passing in the story, but he said in verse 7, do all that is in your heart, do as you wish, I'm with you heart and soul. So a huge amount of loyalty with this guy. And then here's the strategy, verse 8. So he says, here's our plan. We'll let these Philistines see us, and they'll know we're here, and then either one of two things will happen. Either they'll say, wait down there, and they'll come to us, and if they tell us to wait down there, we'll wait. But if they say, come up to us, then we'll interpret that this is a sign from God, and that he's going to give them into our hands. And so they proceed with this plan. They show themselves to the Philistines. In verse 11, you get this kind of derisive response of, look, Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden themselves. They say, come on up and we'll show you a thing. And so, pause here. Did Jonathan say to his armor bearer, man, look at our circumstances. This is bad. We're in a bad spot. It's only me and you. They've got a lot of people. These crags are impossible to get through. This would be crazy of us. We need to take this into our own hands. No, he's not like his dad, right? He doesn't lean on his own understanding. Look what he says in verse 12. He says, come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. And so they scamper up these rocks. They're crawling. And verse 14, and that first strike which Jonathan and his armor bearer made killed about 20 men within, as it were, a half a furrow's length and an acre of land. So, and then verse 15, there's panic in the camp. There's an earthquake, right? And we know, earthquake in the Bible, it's almost always related to God intervening, right? You think about the death and resurrection of Jesus. You think about the Philippian jailer. When the earth is quaking, it suggests that God's involved in this somehow. And meanwhile, during all this, we're in the pomegranate cave. He has people watching. They see the army dispersing. And in verse 17, which is kind of like the height of, I don't know if bureaucracy is the right word, but they decide to take a roll call. So his son's off trying to fight these people and kind of on this expedition, and he decides, and they realize, oh, they're gone. What does Saul call for in verse 18? What's that? The ark, the token, bring it out. You remember this from back in chapter 4? This went well for them. It was a disaster. You remember how they treated it? So he gets the ark. He's talking to the priest. That's good, but things start getting out of hand. And he eventually just says, look, we got to go into battle right now. So verse 20, then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and went into battle. And behold, King's sword was against his fellow, and there was very great confusion. So they get there, and they realize these Philistines are fighting each other. We don't even have to fight them. There's confusion. They're fighting each other. We didn't even need those instruments to fight with that we didn't have, that we were having to sharpen our agricultural tools. So they're fighting each other. It ends in verse 23, so the Lord saved Israel that day. You know, what's the point of this? Is the point well, Jonathan was good and Saul was bad, so we should be like Jonathan. Jonathan didn't save Israel here. It was the Lord that saved Israel that day. You remember at the end of chapter 13, it was this picture of hopelessness where they've got all these troops and our number is dwindling. But what God was really working through all this was to bring them to see that what Jonathan had said could happen was actually going to happen because God was with them. It's kind of reminiscent of Jesus feeding the 5,000, which we've talked about recently, going through Mark on Sunday mornings, which is, there's all these people, they need to be fed. There's a boy, he's got some loaves and a fish. And Andrew says to him, but what are these among so many? The point was that God can save by many or by few, right? The point was some boy with his loaves and fishes came to the aid of Jesus, and he was able to take that and do this great thing. It was, God could have done it with any amount of food. God could have won this battle with any amount of men. It was God using these people to accomplish this great thing. And so here's Jonathan and his armor bearer demonstrating that even in their poverty, even though it's just the two of them, that God is using them to win this battle. Sorry, I rushed through that kind of quickly. I'm trying to get through 14. Any comments on that section? Yes, sir. Right. Right. It's almost pharisaical. It's these acts of religiosity, but there's no faith behind the act or the thing. Yeah. Well. Right. And also the far-reaching effects of Saul's sin, right? What that meant for the rest of his family because of what he did. Yeah. Someone else have a comment? Yes, sir. Yeah, he demonstrates some spontaneity and some audacity, as I described it earlier. We're not given a ton of detail about, I don't know if we can get to it, but in the rest of this chapter, as you've alluded to, he acts kind of extemporaneously and does something he's not supposed to do. But your point, you're right. It was Saul. Yes, sir. That's right. That's right. If Saul had had the faith of Jonathan when he was offering those sacrifices instead of waiting like he was supposed to, if Saul had thought, God can do this by many or by few, God can do this even if their troops swell and we have even fewer, would he have waited or would he have acted like he did? Well, he would have waited. Any other comments? All right. 28 verses, 4 minutes. This section is titled Saul's Rash Oath. Let me summarize here. Saul makes an oath. He says, nobody can eat. He wasn't told to make this oath. It's kind of a selfish oath. Cursed be the man who eats food until it's evening, and I am avenged on my enemies. So someone said earlier, this me, my, mine, a little bit of that. Kind of in contrast to what Jonathan is, maybe it will be that the Lord will work for us. Well, here's Saul saying, well, I need to avenge my enemies. So none of the people are eating. They're hungry. Nobody tells Jonathan, and he eats the honey. He hadn't heard about this oath. They tell him what he's done. He kind of makes a comment like, why did my dad say that? My father has troubled the land. It's kind of like Samuel saying that was a foolish thing to do. They fight the Philistines. They win. And here's the thing. They're so hungry after they fight the Philistines, they start killing these animals and eating them with the blood in it. So what's the contrast here? You have a man-made rule that wasn't given by God, and it actually leads the people to break one of God's commands. They had a God-given command to not eat the animals with the blood, but they're so hungry from this rule that Saul made up that they can't help but to violate God's law. So Saul finds out this is happening. He again puts himself in the position of the priest. He makes an altar. They can now sacrifice the animals on the altar and drain the blood so they can consume them without violating God's law. He wants to pursue the Philistines, and they all agree to. And they're about to head off, and then the priest comes and says, hey, let's draw near to God first. So you see this kind of like jumping the gun, not having the patience that we talked about. Verse 37, he asks God to bless them. God does not answer him. And Saul recognizes that God must be doing this for some kind of sin, and so they have this casting of lots. It gets narrowed down to him and Jonathan. He realizes that it's Jonathan. Verse 43, Jonathan says, almost kind of sarcastically, yeah, I ate some honey. I'm going to die. And the people speak up and say, will he really die? Who's worked this great salvation in Israel? So Jonathan's actually the one that's been leading us. It's not you. Scott, we'll pick up there next Wednesday.